So let's get to today's presentation, which is how to negotiate rules and regulations in the environmental review process. And with us today, let me tell you a little bit more about that. This webinar will go over the basics of the environmental review process, roadblocks that NSP grantees can face during this process, and steps to overcome these obstacles. The presenters will provide environmental review problem-solving techniques. And through the presentation, though the presentation is open to everyone, it's tailored to new NSP3 grantees and new NSP grantee staff. So we have a tidy group of presenters with us today, occupying the panelist seats. And let me come back to where are the... There we go. Sorry. And this is the group. And so we've got with us Eugene Goldfarb, who's an adjunct assistant professor on environmental and occupational health sciences with the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And we have Charles Bean, and he is the director of the Environmental Review Division at HUD, and also David Noguera with the NSP program at HUD, and likely Hunter Kurtz as well. So welcome to all of you today. And with that, let me now get this over to Eugene, and take it away, Eugene Goldfarb.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank HUD's Office of Environment and Energy and Enterprise Community Partners for giving me the opportunity to talk about the environmental review process. I'm going to try and not make it too complicated, just try to get a few basic points across, and there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. I like to start out by saying, why do we have to do it? And the easy answer is it's the law. There's the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. Applies to all federal agencies, not just HUD. But, you know, you have to do it. There's no choice. But and also to withstand opposition, that because it's the law, if you don't do it and somebody's against your project, let's say you have a not in my backyard, a locally unwanted land use, and some of our best projects are those where you're putting affordable housing in a great neighborhood, and there are some people in the neighborhood who don't like your project. They have standing under NEPA. They could oppose you, and if you haven't followed the procedures, they can make trouble. If you've done things right, you're okay, but if you haven't gone through the procedures correctly, they can make a lot of trouble for you. The main reason that you do it, though, is to make a better project. NEPA is environmental planning, and planning comes up with better projects. Most people developing housing, their first impulse is, how many units could I put on this site? And not all, and is there a market for it? And not always is, well, is there a floodplain here? Is the site contaminated? Is there a historic resource that I might have to think about? So the environmental process forces us to think about all these things and to include them in the decision-making process. Okay, who does the work? And for NSP3, it's local governments. It's not that you're going to pick a site and send it to HUD, and then HUD will do an environmental review. No, it's that the local governments are the entities that are responsible for environmental review. And this is nothing new. When the Housing and Community Development Act of '74 was passed, inaugurating the Community Development Block Grant Program, it was felt that since we had special revenue sharing, where we want the local governments to decide what projects to do where, that the NEPA environmental planning process was part of the decision-making process and belonged at the local level. Therefore, it's something that local government does, and there's somebody that's been doing this in your local government entity since 1974. Maybe they're in the community development department. It's either the part of your local government that's running the community development block grant if you're an entitlement. But even if you're not an entitlement, if you're a smaller local government, you've probably gotten funding from the state program, the Small Cities program, and you got to go to those people and say, gee, how did you do the environmental review in the past? And that'll give you an idea of what to do locally. There might, for some of the smaller communities, there might be a regional planning agency or a state agency that has provided assistance in the past. But what I want you to think of is that you're not starting de novo from scratch, that this has been done before, and you just go to whoever's done it before and say, gee, how could we get started working on our NSP3 projects? One of the things that's been done recently is use of environmental contractors. Like if you have a multifamily project, not an individual single-family homes, you're going to probably need a phase 1 and or phase 2 environmental site assessment looking for site contamination. I'll discuss that a little later in the presentation. Well, a lot of these people who do these phase 1s and phase 2s now do an enhanced environmental site assessment where they will do a lot of the legwork for preparing an environmental review. Now, the local government is still the responsible entity. They have to sign off on it and publish the notices, request the release of funds from HUD. But if you feel that you don't have that local capacity, there are lots of choices. That's the point that I'm trying to get across. One of the most important things I'm going to say today is, when does the work begin? And the answer to that is as soon as possible. I can't tell you how many projects I've been involved in where some developer had a housing project that they put together, they have working plans and specs, and then their mortgage banker told them, well, we're going to have to get government financing. And at that point, they started thinking about, oops, we got to do an environmental process. Well, if somebody has working plans or specs, they're not going to want to change anything. And they just want to go through a meaningless paper sign-off, and they're really not willing to look honestly and say, are there any environmental issues, and what are we going to do about them? So my message to you is, as soon as you start talking to people about, gee, what about this site? What about this developer? You start saying, you know, we're going to have to do an environmental review. Let's look at floodplains. Let's look at wetlands. Let's look at historic resources. Let's look at contaminated sites. And it has to be, the earlier you start it, the more you'll be able to affect decision making. The one thing that you don't want to do is, there's a regulation, 24 CFR 5822, that says neither recipient nor any participant, in other words, not just the local government, but maybe there's a subcontractor or the developer, they may not only expend the non-HUD funds, but even commit them on the activity prior to the approval of that activity. What does that mean? Let's say there's a historic building that's on your site, and you're saying, gee, can we knock it down before we get the HUD funds, and just a private person will do it? And the obvious answer is no, you can't. If you do that, you may pretty much knock out any chance of federal funding for that project. So don't do that.
Let me underscore that this is Charlie Bean at HUD. I just want to underscore what Eugene's just said, that this is a point that everybody has to put down in big bold letters. Neither the recipient of the funds nor anybody involved in the development process can commit or expend HUD or non-HUD funds to the project until the whole environmental review process is completed. Very, very important. It can kill your project very clearly if you do that. Go ahead, Eugene. Underscore that.
And we don't want people crying about it, so don't do that. And like I said, in terms of promoting environmental planning to have a better project, you really want to start your environmental review process as soon as you're even thinking about the project. Now, people may say, well, that won't work for us, because once they find out there's a government project, the price of the land is going to zoom up, And gee, how are we supposed to do our project? Well, the answer to that is you're allowed to purchase an option. You're allowed to enter into an option agreement saying that, I'm going to purchase this piece of property if it passes environmental review, and you may ask for 3 months or 6 months on that option agreement, and you don't exercise it until you've completed the environmental review process, but you've taken that piece of property off the market while you're undergoing the environmental review. And with this and anything else, if you have any questions about this, you have local environmental people that I'll show you where to get their contact information that you could discuss your particular project with. Okay, so let's talk about the environmental review process. I have a chart here, and I'm not going to go over it specifically, but I want you to see that there are 3 main paths of going down through it. And the one path is pretty simple. That's this path here on the right, and you can see not much is going on. And that's it doesn't really apply for NSP3, but that's if you're not doing anything physical. If you are doing something physical, you're talking about either building new or fixing up, doing rehab on something that's already there. If you're fixing up something that's already there, you're going through this categorical exclusion. If you're doing something new construction, you're talking about doing a full environmental assessment. The main reason I put this flow chart on was for you to see it's not just a simple process. Like doing the environmental assessment is just part of the process, but you're also publishing notices of finding of no significant impact. You're making a finding, you're publishing a notice, and then you're submitting the request for release of funds and certification to HUD. HUD is waiting 15 days, and you can't actually start the project, make your commitment until HUD has released the funds and told you you can go ahead. So the environmental process is one of not just doing an assessment where we look at, is this the right place to put the project? How does the environment impact the project? Is it in a floodplain? Is it in a wetland? Is it on a contaminated site? But also the impact of the project on the environment. Will I be generating traffic? Will I be generating stormwater that will exacerbate flooding? You look at all that, and you do it at the earliest decision-making stage so that it's possible to do something about it. You can modify or maybe even abandon the project. Those sites we could work with. We could find a solution. We just identify the problem, and we figure out a way to fix it. And as I pointed out on the previous slide, there's an element of public disclosure. It's not just that somebody does this, but also that you have to get anyone who may be interested or affected by the project, whether it's government units or groups or individuals, they have a right to look at the environmental assessment. You want to hear what they have to say, and you want to include that input into your project decision-making so you come up with the best possible project. Now, one of your first questions might be, well, how much time does this take? And the answer is it depends. It depends upon issues. If you have a lot of issues, that's your critical path, and it might take a long time to resolve that floodplain issue. It might take a long time to resolve that contaminated site issue, and that's another reason why you want to start the environmental review process as early as possible to identify these issues and work through them so that that's not what's holding up your whole planning and development process. The 2 notices that I pointed to earlier when I had the FONSI notice over here and the request for release of funds over here, those right away are 30 days. So you're talking about a minimum of 30 days on the process. Before you can even make your finding of no significant impact, you have to have a sign-off from your state historic preservation officer. That usually takes at least 30 days, even if there's no issue. If there is a historic resource and you're going to have an adverse impact on it, it could be months to resolve that. Other issues such as floodplains or contaminated sites, depending upon how serious it is, it could add a lot of time. So once again, start as early as possible in the process.
Let me just add one little footnote into that, Eugene. I don't mean to complicate the matter, but
no, I like you adding, Charlie.
in addition to the State Historic Preservation Officer, under some circumstances, tribes have to be contacted also. Eugene will show this when we get into the specific historic preservation process compliance actions. But it's both the SHPO and, in some cases, tribes that have special cultural significance for that area that you don't want to be digging up an Indian burial ground or something like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Charlie, because I noticed there's another NSP webinar, I think it's next Thursday, that deals with that in detail. If you're dealing in a city that hasn't had these issues in the past, don't get too excited about it. Talk to the people who have done the Part 58 environmental reviews. Ask them what you generally do. But especially if you're in a rural area, if you're doing new construction on a piece of land that hasn't been developed before, tribal consultation can be very important. Okay, so let's talk about the two comment periods. We said that assessment is not only what you're doing, but you're also involving the public, you're involving other agencies. There's a public participation element to this environmental planning process. Well, I want you to think of two separate comment periods. The first one is when you make your finding of no significant impact and you say, I'm not going to prepare an environmental impact statement, which is a long, detailed process. I've looked at the impact of the environment on this project, the project on the environment, and we're going to go ahead and build the project. So you tell the public that there's this environmental review record that they could come in and look at, they could ask questions, they could give you information that's not in there that'll help you make a better decision, and you give them 15 days to do this. If anyone has any comments, they submit it to you, the local government, and they ask you to reconsider your FONSI to maybe redesign the project. After that 15-day time period is concluded, you then submit the request for release of funds for HUD, which opens another 15-day period. At that point, people may follow not a substantive comment, but a procedural objection to HUD, where they tell HUD, hey, that local government didn't do a good job. They never contacted the State Historic Preservation Officer. The project was in a floodplain, and they never published a finding, a notice of intent to take an action in a floodplain. So they don't say specifically there's a problem, but they say that you, the local government, did not go through the right procedures. And if it turns out that they're correct, HUD may bounce it back to you and say, correct this before we release the funds. But I just want you to think of public participation is a significant element of the environmental review process, and there are two comment periods. One is substantive to the local government. The other is procedural to HUD. Here's the notice that you would publish. The notice talks about that there are it's a combined notice, so it mentions both of these. You get this notice off of the HUD website. I'll show you that later in the webinar. You say there are no significant impacts. The substantive comments sent to the local government, procedural comments sent to HUD. Now, there are two sets of environmental review factors. Environment, as I'm going to show you, is defined very broadly. There's one set that are statutory where there are separate laws. I think there are like 18 of them that if you didn't have to do a NEPA review, you would still have to show you're complying with all of these 18 laws. Then there are a whole other set of factors where there's not separate laws, like do you have water and sewer, what are the soils like, how close is shopping, that are factors that are part of your environmental review but are not statutory in basis. Here's what the statutory, the applicable authorities are. You see I have a little picture of an umbrella just to point out that NEPA is the umbrella that covers all these environmental laws. Like, you don't need a separate piece of paper for historic preservation. Your historic review is part of your NEPA review. Likewise, for all these separate laws, and HUD has separate environmental standards for noise, above-ground storage tanks, and sites that are near airports. But the environmental review, if you're doing new construction or substantial rehab, encompasses much more than what these separate laws are. I've had projects where there was a shadow from the building, and that was an issue. I've had projects where we were building in a suburb that the schools were on triple session already. So the question was, will these housing units have an adverse impact on the schools? Oh, I guess they will. Okay, what are we going to do about it? And we figured something out. Is police and fire okay there? There could be, you could see that almost anything you could think of could fit under the environmental umbrella. And if it's an issue, if it's something that should affect what type of project you have, then you have to note that in your environmental review, explain why either that it's not a problem, or if it is a problem, why is it a problem? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to change the project? At least have a paper trail showing that you've looked at all these things and they're not a problem, or there is a problem, and here's how we're going to resolve it. Now, there are suggested formats for environmental review. I'll be showing you in a few minutes where you could pull that off of the HUD website. But as I mentioned, there's somebody in your local government who's been doing this. They're familiar with these formats. In some areas of the country, our field environmental officers have done a lot of work putting together guidance and formats, and you might want to contact them and ask them, what format should I be using? What I'm showing here is that there are two separate formats. One of them, if you're just doing rehab and fixing up not a substantial rehab, but moderate rehab of something that already exists, you'll use what we call a categorically excluded format that only includes the statutory checklist. If you're doing new construction or substantial rehab, you'll be doing a full NEPA environmental assessment checklist that will include everything, not just what's on the statutory checklist. Okay, now let's get back to that flow chart. And we said we're going to do an assessment, we're going to publish notices, and we're going to make sure we incorporate environmental planning into our project. But what I want to get across now is there's a difference between an activity and a project. An activity is something that you use HUD funds to fund, maybe to build this site. But maybe there's, so many projects, there's public-private partnerships, or there's partnerships between the federal government and the local government. And different partners are acting and fulfilling different roles in the development process. Maybe there was a brownfield site, and maybe EPA cleaned up the site, and maybe the local government knocked down some buildings that were sitting there, and maybe the NSP funding is just to build new construction housing on that site. So the question is, what do we do the environmental assessment on? Is it just on building the new housing, or is it the total project? And the answer, very clearly, is the total project. Why? Because when NEPA was first passed in '69, in the early 70s, they had the first test cases in front of the federal courts. They said, what's the subject of the environmental review? And they said it's the entire project, that you can't use the private funds to knock down that historic building or to do something that you couldn't do if it was a federally funded project. And as Charlie pointed out earlier, you can't start any of that until you've done the environmental review for the entire project. So one of the most important points I could get across today is aggregation. What is the project? If something was done 10 years ago, okay, that was done 10 years ago, that's not part of the project. But if people aren't moving ahead until we get the funding for this project and there's some type of legal agreement that locks it all together, then that's what the project is, and that's what you got to think about. Okay, I want to talk now about some of the ticket items, some of the components of environmental review, just to give you a flavor of what might happen in your environmental review. One of the most prominent things now is what we call site contamination, and you'll get what is commonly referred to as a Phase 1 environmental site assessment that's prepared according to the American Society of Testing Materials as protocols. It's done by an environmental professional. The price varies with size and complexity. It's not the same as a NEPA review. Some of these you could ask the professional to add the NEPA elements to what they're doing, and that'll help you do the NEPA review. But this is something that's done mainly for site contamination, and it's done nowadays for even private sector, because people don't want to be responsible if contamination is discovered on the site. And there were some exceptions that were built into circular. There was a 2002 Brownfields Act that if you do due diligence and you're an innocent landowner, you look for the contamination, you didn't discover it, even if they find it, you're not liable. Another thing that we look at is floodplains. There's a separate Flood Disaster Protection Act of '73. There are also executive orders on floodplains and wetlands that says don't take any action in a floodplain or wetland unless there's no practical alternative, and prescribes an 8-step process. What does that mean for you? It doesn't mean you can't build in a floodplain or wetland. It means you got to proceed very carefully. Why? Here's a road in Wisconsin that was built in a floodplain. Sure, you got to build a road in a floodplain to cross it, but don't be surprised if it's flooded out and there's significant damage. Here's a site in a mile from the Mississippi River, nowhere near the Mississippi River, but in 1993, here's how high the floodwaters came. So you got to look at the floodplain map that you get from FEMA's website, and we expect the floodplain map with the site outlined, here's where the site is, to be in every environmental review. And if you do have a site in a floodplain, what if it's something like this, where your whole neighborhood is in the floodplain? Sure, you could build in the floodplain. You just have to go through the 8-step process. You'll also be required to take out flood insurance. You'll be required to comply with the local ordinance that'll tell you to elevate the lowest floor at least above the base flood elevation. Historic preservation is another item that's expected to be on every environmental review. At the very least, we want a sign-off letter from the State Historic Preservation Officer, at least saying that there's no historic properties affected, but maybe it's more complicated than that. Some of our best projects affect historic properties and have an adaptive reuse that'll put new life into old buildings. If you're dealing with a private developer, there are significant benefits to rehabbing old buildings. There's a 20% federal tax credit. Many states have their own tax credits. I think Indiana has its own 20% tax credit that makes it very lucrative for a private developer to rehab an older structure. And you can see you go through the process. Most of us will have no historic properties affected, but if it's adaptive reuse, we'll say it's no historic properties adversely affected. And even if there is an adverse impact, maybe we're knocking down a historic building, we could do it. We just got to go through the process. We have to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer and reach a memorandum of agreement. How do we get the information? How do we know if there are historic property? Almost every state has done surveys. They did them in the 70s. Here's an example in Illinois where they actually have it online, and they show historic districts. They show individual properties. Your state, you want to contact your State Historic Preservation Officer. Ask them, where do I go to find out this information? And we mentioned the tax credits, and there are other incentives also. One thing that we look at HUD that local governments may not pay as much attention to is noise. If you're putting a noise-sensitive land use, such as housing, next to an airport, an interstate, or a railroad, or even a busy highway, that may trigger certain requirements. If you're anywhere near a railroad or a highway, you're probably going to be in this normally unacceptable range, which is not a big deal. That most of us nowadays use double glazed windows, central air conditioning, and we can take care of it. But if we're right at the end of the airport, if we're right next to the interstate, it may be greater than 75, and maybe a residential land use is not the best land use for that parcel of land. In those cases, as in any other cases where you have a significant environmental issue, you'll be wanting to talk to your field environmental officer, who will help you understand and evaluate the serious environmental issues. But what you have to know is that you have to do initial screening. If there's an airport within 5 miles, if there's a railroad within 3,000 feet and you have line of sight of exposure, if there's a busy roadway within 1,000 feet. And generally, what's a busy roadway? It's one where you can get traffic data on it from your highway department. And if you have one of those, you're going to have to at least do a noise assessment, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, the HUD site, that you just plug in the all this information, the distance, the traffic, the speeds, and it'll tell you what the noise level is and if you have to do anything about it. Another thing that we might have to look at is explosive or flammable hazards. What are those? You could see over here, like here's a fire. This is a one-story building. Here's even a water tower. But we're talking about above-ground storage tanks, that there's a danger of them either leaking and catching fire or exploding. And normally, these are not in residential areas. Normally, they're industrial areas, but here's an example, for instance, in East Chicago, Indiana, where there's a residential neighborhood that's right across the street from these above-ground storage tanks. In those cases, you also want to go to HUD's website, which I will show you in a minute or two, and you just enter the information. It's really not that hard. And you say how big is the tank, how close is it, and it'll tell you if it's within the safe separation distance. I want to close in highlighting the things you may run into by talking about environmental justice. What's environmental justice? It's when there's a disproportionate impact on a protected class. So, you know, there are lots of market rate projects that have high noise impact or that may be built on a brownfield site. And there's nothing wrong with having some environmental issues as long as, number one, you deal with them, and number two, when you're dealing with a protected class, which would either be minority or low income. The Executive Order on Environmental Justice does not just deal, like a lot of our civil rights laws, with race and ethnicity, but also provides that low-income people are a protected class for environmental justice. And if you're saying, well, we couldn't build a market rate housing here, but this is affordable housing with the subsidies, people live wherever we put them, you just can't do that with environmental justice. So you have an environmental issue, deal with it, and make sure that the environment for this project is representative of similar projects that are market rate projects in your community. Okay, now I'd like to show you, like, where do you get a lot of this information? And there's a lot of web-based tools and resources that are available. If you can't find them, if the person who's been doing your environmental reviews doesn't know where they are, talk to your field environmental officer, do a Google search. But what I'd like to do now is just show you quickly one or two things. The first thing I'd like to show you is the
And your
is
screen
the
will
HUD.
flash here for a moment, and that's normal while Eugene brings up his web browser. There we go.
Okay, they have it. So the first thing, here's the HUD website. And I'd like you to see, like, if you just get into HUD.gov and you hit topic areas, and right from topic areas you go to environment, you'll be seeing the HUD website. And there's so much information here. HUD has put a lot of work and a lot of resources. And if I wanted to know more about the HUD Environmental Review, this is where I would start. The first place I would look at is HUD Contacts, and I would see where's my local staff. And depending upon where you're located, region 1, 2, 3, you see for every region, it tells you here are the local environmental officers. And, right away, I would contact them, check what format should I use. And if you have any issues, any questions, that's where I would go first. Environmental review requirements, I also want to point out that there are lots of resources there. Here's the different formats if you're categorically excluded or doing an NEPA review, and then resources on particular elements, technical guidance and forms. If you want, here's a manual for conducting an environmental review, sample notices, a noise guidebook, lots of resources on this site. And I want you to look at that. And what I also want you to point out to you is there's this great thing, assessment tools for environmental compliance. And what it has is lots of resources on the different elements of environmental review. I'm going to show you screenshots afterwards, but here's for the above ground storage tanks. You can see how easy it is to get to there. And for noise, there's also the DNL calculator, and you can see you add a road source and you put the information in, and it's just so easy to use. And if you have any questions, you ask the person who's been doing this at your local government, or you ask your field environmental officer. Training, if you're having a lot of difficulty, you may want to look at where the training is. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to show you is there's something called NEPA Assist. And you could just do like a web search on NEPA Assist, but here's what it looks like when you enter it. This is a site that's run by EPA, and it could help get you started on your environmental review. Like, I'm going to put a site in here. And it's as easy as that. You type in your site, and it finds the site for you. And then over here on the right, it says select map contents. And for instance, this site, I know there's a flooding problem. So I'm going to say, show me where the floodplains are. And right away, you can see it shows me there's a floodplain. Now, for your file, you're still going to have to find the FEMA map, and because that's a legal document, but this shows you that you have a floodplain problem. What else could I get from this? Remember I said you need to do a Phase 1 environmental site assessment if you're dealing with a multifamily project. But what if it's single family and you don't want to go to that expense? You're supposed to look at EPA databases. Well, you could open NEPA Assist, you go to the right on EPA facilities, and you check all these boxes, and it will load, and it loaded a lot faster before, but it will load that document for me, and it will show me where these EPA facilities are. And then what I could do once it does load them is I could go over to them and click on them, and it'll give me more information. Like it's not doing it now, but previously when I looked at this site, there was like a dry cleaner, and then I can measure how close they are. Now, one final thing I want to show you, let's say we want to look at an aerial view. So we go aerial view, and then look at this site. What are these things over here? These look like above ground storage tanks. And remember I told you that above ground storage tanks, we have to do an analysis. So I'm still going to have to contact the operator and find out how close they are, but I could go over here to the measure, and I could click on my site, and then I could measure, and look, it's 0.514 miles, and I could times that times, 5,280, and find out how many feet away that tank is. Okay, so let me go back. So I just wanted to show you those things to show you that there's a lot of resources on the web. Okay, I showed you that. Other stuff that's on the web is there's USGS topographic surveys where you could see the topography. For instance, here's a site we looked at. It was all developed around here. This was in the D.C. area. You know, why wasn't this site developed? When we looked at the USGS map, we saw that it had previously been a gravel pit, and we could see the steep slopes showing on the USGS map. Here's aerial photos. Anybody could get those now. Just on Google, you could switch and get an aerial photo. But you could see, you could do that on NEPASYS. You could do that on the sites where you get the USGS maps. Wetlands is a site in a wetland. Well, there's National Map Viewer. Here's the URL for it, and you can see it identifies the wetlands. It's only an initial screening tool. It gives you a general idea if a wetland is nearby, and if there is, then you might have to do higher level testing. You'd have to hire somebody to go out and stake out that wetland. Does it affect your project? And that would be part of your critical path. That would tell you, gee, it's not going to take 5 days to resolve that. It may take a few months. If you're going in an outlying area, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service has prepared soil maps. If you don't yet have a preliminary soils report for your site, this will give you an idea if you have decent soils to build on. Traffic maps. Remember I mentioned noise, and I said that if you have a street where there are traffic counts, you should do, and it's near your project within that 1,000 feet unobstructed, then you should do a noise analysis. Here's what these traffic maps may look like. Okay, not only information on the internet, but you're generally dealing with a sponsor. So you should ask them what type of information that you have that could help me do my environmental planning, do my environmental review. Have you already done your phase 1 or phase 2? If they have, you want that. If they've done a preliminary soils report, you want that. If they've done a traffic study or a market study, you want that. You want the water and sewer plans for new construction, a new subdivision. Maybe they know what they're doing and they've already got a sign-off letter from the State Historic Preservation Officer. Don't reinvent the wheel. Get whatever they have. Here's an example from a phase 2, actually, where they indicated a history that it might be contaminated. For instance, here's a site where there were some buried underground storage tanks, and then all of these little circles are where they did soil testing, and then they drew a picture of what they thought the contamination would look like around the building. So if phase 1 or phase 2 has been done, you want that as part of your environmental review. Okay, remember I showed this to you earlier. Once you complete the environmental review, don't forget to publish your notices. Most of you will be doing a combined notice of finding a no significant impact of intent to request release of funds. You'll be telling the public that we've done the review. We're not going to do an environmental impact statement. If you have any substantive comments, send it to us, the local government. Here's where you could find the environmental review if you want to come in and look at it. Some local governments are starting to publish this on their website, and in 5 or 10 years from now, I'm sure that's going to be very commonplace. And you're also telling people that we're going to be requesting a release of funds from HUD, and if you think we haven't gone through the correct procedures, here's the address of the local HUD office where you could object to the release of funds from HUD. How is HUD involved in this process? Well, first of all, I said they don't do the environmental review, but they receive the request for release of funds and they'll process it. You'll be submitting that with a 7015.15, which is this form. You'll be attaching copies of the notices that you publish with proof of publication in the paper, from the paper, or if you posted them, proof and a procedure where and how you posted it, and you'll be asking for the release of funds. And somebody at HUD will log that in. They'll wait the 15 days, and then they will release the funds. They will not review your environmental review record. They'll be relying upon your certification that you've gone through that process. Does that mean HUD will never look at your environmental review record? No. HUD goes out and monitor. The regulation says that we should try and do it every 3 years. Staffing may not allow that, but don't be surprised if one of these days somebody from HUD comes out, a field environmental officer, or even a CPD rep, and says, let me look at your environmental review record for this NSP3 project. And they'll look at the review, and I'll point out what is included in the environmental review record, and they'll hopefully find out everything's okay, or they'll issue monitoring findings. Remember, also, we talked earlier, Charlie even made a point of saying a limitation on action pending clearance. If HUD has read in the newspaper that there was a groundbreaking on your project, and then 2 weeks later the project comes in, don't be surprised if HUD says, excuse me, did you start this project? You weren't supposed to, and we can't release the funds. I mentioned that when HUD comes out and reviews, they'll look at the environmental review record. What's in that environmental review record? Anything and everything relating to the process. A description of the project, documentation that each step has been accomplished. This is a paper trail showing that you've done everything you're supposed to have done, and not, interview that person. They'll tell you that they did everything. I called somebody up. Don't worry, I took care of it. There's nothing wrong with a phone call, but there should be a notation in the file, preferably on the form that you're using, saying on this date, I called this person, and here's what they told me. There should be a paper trail documenting that you've looked at every item on the form and you've made sure that everything is okay. Documentation is important, not just for the HUD monitoring, not just for public disclosure, but remember earlier we said, not in my backyard, locally unwanted land use. If people are against you, they have standing to sue you. If they have some attorneys who live in the neighborhood that'll do this work pro bono, you're going to win if you have a well-documented file. Not if you have a good project, but if you have a well-documented file. If you don't have a well-documented file, you might be in trouble. The file should speak for itself. You shouldn't need somebody else to interpret, don't worry, it's not here, but we did this. It should be clear in the file that we contacted everyone we were supposed to, and here's the answers that we got. So what's my conclusion? And I'm saying this half tongue in cheek. Kids, don't try this at home. If this is the first time you've ever done an environmental review, I would proceed very cautiously. It's not something that each of you can't do. It's a generalist thing. Each of you can do it, but the first thing I would do would be to say, hey, who's done this before? Either we're an entitlement community, so I know we get funds, who does the Part 58 reviews, or we're a small community, but we've gotten small city funding through the state before. How did we do this before? Either I'm going to find that person locally and they're going to help me do this, or I'm going to say, well, gee, before we had somebody else do it, what are my other choices? Maybe there's a regional planning agency. Maybe there's a colleague in a neighboring community. With the NSP program, we do a lot of networking, and maybe I could network with somebody who has the expertise that I feel comfortable working with. And finally, this is part of doing a project. You hire an architect to do a project. You hire an engineer to do a project. You hire experts to help you. There should be someone on your development team. Maybe it's, if you're doing multifamily housing, maybe it's the person who's doing that phase 1 environmental site assessment who could help you out with this. They can't be a responsible entity. Only local governments can do that, but they could still go a long way to helping you do your environmental review. If you have any questions, help is available. I pointed out on the HUD website where your local HUD environmental officer is, who they are, their contact information. That's who you should be working with. I would not go up to them and ask them to do every little thing for me. You're just going to get on their annoying list. But they want to hear about issues. You have an above-ground storage tank, like I showed you near that, what was a real NSP project maybe a year or two ago. They'll help you do that analysis. They want to know about an issue. You have a project like that one that's in a floodplain. They're very happy to hear about that, to look at your notice of intent to take an action in a floodplain, help guide you through the 8-step process that you'll need to go if you want to build in a floodplain. So don't be afraid to contact your HUD people. Work through your local environmental officer, and if there are any problems, like, for instance, Nelson Rivera for the above-ground storage tanks, I found them very helpful when I've had projects near above-ground storage tanks, but I first worked through my field environmental officer. Here's our final slide to show you what are some places where you could start. Here's the regulations. Here's the 2 forms, one for new construction and substantial rehab, one for moderate rehab. Here's where you get the combined notice. Here's where you get the request release of HUD funds form. You could either use this URL or you could go through the HUD website like I showed you. So I think now we're, Ken, are we ready to open it up for questions?
We are, and I can come back to this slide in a little bit. And so now it's time to ask questions, and here's how you do it. And again, I ask you to leave all panelists as the subjects of your questions. That's the default. And James asks, when you say substantial rehab, does that only pertain to large buildings, or does that also include individual houses?
That's a good question. This is relevant when you're talking about what level of review do I have to do. Do I have to do the full environmental assessment, the NEPA assessment, or do I just have to do a statutory checklist, which are those maybe 18 separate laws and authorities, what we call a statutory checklist, or we might call it Part A of the entire NEPA form. Now, as a matter of fact, I didn't want to present too much detail to confuse people. I was trying to keep it simple, but there is an individual categorical exclusion, even if it's new construction, if it's an individual action on a 1 to 4 family structure. So even if you're doing new construction on a 1 to 4 family structure, that may itself be a categorical exclusion, and that may not require the full NEPA assessment. You could always do more, but if you want to, you could do the categorical exclusion. One thing that I didn't cover, like, why would you want to do a categorical exclusion? Well, if you do a categorical exclusion and you go through all those items on the statutory checklist and everything is clean, there's no items that require compliance with any of these applicable authorities. For instance, you're not in a floodplain, you're not affecting a historic resource, you may magically, this is pure magic, convert to exempt and not have to publish any notices or request the release of funds. So I was trying to stay away from that to keep it simple, but...
Can I interrupt just a second, Eugene?
Sure.
This is a point of confusion as to what's substantial and what's not substantial. And it gets further confused because programs have their own definitions of this, sometimes having to do with dollar amounts, of percent of rehabilitation of market value, and all kind of different things like this. I don't want to go into the specifics because it does get complicated, and we're trying to cover this in an hour and a half, which isn't really time to get into all the details. But there are two sections in the regulations. There's a section under 5835, A3, and there's a section under 5835B, and within there you will find the criteria that require different kinds of considerations, if you will, of what's going to happen with the rehabilitation that make it substantial or not substantial. There's all kinds of things of change of density and things like this that you have to think about in terms of which level of review you do. And they're found in 5835, and exemptions are found in 58.35, 58.34.
But the bottom line is, you don't make this up. Anything you do, you're basing it on what's in the regulations.
Nicole asks, we are an NSP3 grantee doing only acquisition, rehab, and resale. If we expand our current target areas, do we need to do an amendment to our existing environmental review record to cover the expansion area?
The answer is yes. Even if it's the same kinds of property, etc., you must have an environment. You must have in your environmental record that you considered every property for which there's going to be some federal assistance.
Yeah, just think if you're an opponent and you're challenging it, you want to have a paper trail that could point back to any property that you're dealing with, that you checked floodplains, you checked historic preservation, you checked site contamination. And if you did that the first time for one physical area and you didn't do that for the second physical area, that's a procedural defect.
That makes sense. Eric says, is using Google Earth with the stay dry layer to print flood maps acceptable? It's the same information as the FEMA site, and Google Earth is much more user-friendly.
That's a good question, and Charlie's the authority on it, but when I've done training and I've had speakers from FEMA, they make a point of saying, a permit is the legal document, and you have to have your permit. And I'm sure at some point that's going to change, especially, I was thinking more with local GIS systems where you have somebody who certifies that here's where they got the data and it's correct. But my understanding is right now you need the permit in every file.
Yes, and in the foreseeable future too, Eugene.
James asks, when measuring distances for noise levels, what is considered unobstructed?
There's, if you get into it, on the noise assessment guidelines, there's ways you can compute barrier and how effective a barrier is. Strictly speaking, you should be looking at all roads within 1,000 feet and doing the assessment, and then you look at the buildings and you do the barrier analysis, and you say, there's a barrier, it doesn't work. Some field environmental officers will let you shortcut that, and they'll say, gee, there's a solid row of buildings, you can't see the highway, this roadway, no way, don't worry about it. I would speak to my local field environmental officer. If you're asking me, what's the strict correct answer, it's that any roadway within 1,000 feet, You do the noise analysis, and then you do a barrier analysis.
Maggie says, when completing a SHPO, how do we know if and when tribal has to be notified?
There is being posted within the next couple weeks on the environmental website a listing by county of all the national recognized tribes and Indian nations, federally recognized. And we have surveyed and keep it up to date, and we'll keep it up to date annually. Counties that different tribes have said they have an interest in projects within those counties. And if you go on the HUD website and you go into environment, you go into historic preservation, within a couple weeks, and you pull it up, you'll be able to identify if there are any tribes in the country that are interested in any projects in the county where your project is going to be located. And also on that, at that site, you will be able to email to the tribal officer, be it the chief or the president or a staff person at the tribe, and tell them your project and ask them if they are interested in commenting on the project. If they say yes, then you should give them the information they need in order to comment on it, just like you would with a SHPO.
And I have a suggestion to make. Like, just as if this is the first time that you're in a position, you might want to contact the State Historic Preservation Officer and say, oh, here's what we're going to do. What do you generally expect from me? I would go to, as I mentioned, the person in your local government who's been doing these Part 58 reviews. And this is where HUD policy is changing a little bit. And I would look at what tribes have expressed an interest in my geographical jurisdiction. And I'm suggesting that not just on a project-by-project basis, but I would write them an initial contact letter or email and saying, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing, and what do you generally want to look at? And, let's try and reach an agreement on how this will be handled. And that way, you may be able to get a sign-off that's blanket for a whole class of actions and avoid individual contacts and waiting 30 days for individual projects. And generally, you want both sides to be happy with the process. You want to start off you don't want to be contentious from the get-go. You want to say, gee, we want to do this right. What do you expect? If what they're saying you think is unreasonable, you talk to your HUD field environmental officer and say, gee, what should our expectations be? But, while we're starting to implement this new policy, let's try and figure out a way to do it where there's least amount of friction.
I would also mention on the tribal thing, too, that some tribes, for example, some of the Cherokee tribes who are located in Oklahoma, have deep interest in projects back in North Carolina because that was their tribal land before they were pushed out of it. So it may or may not be a tribe that's physically in the area of your project that has an interest in the project.
Sure. Kathleen asks, we should save the documentation of the environmental review record for 3 years after closeout, and how is closeout defined?
Closeout is defined by the program area itself. Okay. When there is no longer any federal interest in any kind of non-environmental compliance issues, be they fiscal or what have you, then the further continuation of environmental compliance is not necessary unless there were mitigation measures that require continuous ongoing monitoring. For example, underground methane releases that need to be done regardless of 3 years after the project.
Or even flood insurance.
Or flood insurance runs forever and ever. So there are some environmental mitigation actions that do not terminate even 3 years after the project is closed out. And those may run forever and ever. That's unlikely, but it's possible.
Julian is interested in whether you can combine an NSP3 environmental review with a combined FONSI NOI for the annual CDBG home environmental review.
If it's the same project and it has multiple, exactly the same project, okay, underscore, highlight, bright lights, exact same project. Remember how Eugene went through aggregation and project earlier in the presentation? If it's the same project, you can have one review for multiple HUD funding sources. Okay, and that quite often happens. Okay. And you will need to identify all the funding sources on your public notification processes. For example, on the notice of intent to request release of funds. In the FONSI itself, you will need to identify in that so that the public is aware that there's multiple funding sources also. But there can be one review that covers multiple HUD funding sources, provided it is exactly the same project.
Jim asks, are yards and outside areas considered in noise calculations or just the buildings?
That's discretionary. I forget the exact wording of the regulations, but it talks about if it's determined that quiet outdoor areas are necessary as an ancillary use. In other words, at least in my mind, let's say I'm doing single-family homes, and I think there's a reasonable expectation that people want to be able to talk to each other in their backyard. So in my view, the noise regulations would apply to the backyard. Does that mean that the regulations, the 65 day-night noise level, applies to every piece of open space on the project? No. And it's generally okay if some of the open space has high noise levels, as long as there's, and this is a local call, do you feel that there is a sitting area or a recreation area that's a real important part of the project? And if there is, then that area should be below 65.
If it's directly related to the residential land use. However, I don't think if you have a parking lot next to an apartment building, I don't think the parking lot is considered open space.
Yeah, so it's local discretion.
Very good. Lori asks, when doing an environmental review for demolition, are we assessing the demolition activity itself or the end result, which may be vacant?
Both.
That's an excellent question. And remember, we talked about aggregation. So aggregation means we should be doing both. Sometimes, though, and let's discuss this, Charlie, you're just not under NSP3. NSP3, I think you're funding the housing. Sometimes under HUD funding, you may just be doing demolition because it's slum and blight, and you don't know if you'll ever be building anything there. On the other hand, remember we were talking about why you're doing this. You're doing it for environmental planning. And it makes sense to say, hey, what is this piece of property, even though I'm only doing demolition, is it in a floodplain? Does it have a high noise level? Is it near an above-ground storage tank? To highlight those environmental issues so if and when people start looking at future land uses, they'll have some environmental input in terms of making the best decision.
Let me remind people of that this webinar is being recorded and archived, and you'll be notified when it's available on the NSP website. It'll include an AV recording of today's event, along with the PDF version of the slides and a written transcript. And here's some upcoming NSP webinars, just all 4 of these in the next, 3 of them in the next couple weeks, one of them in July. Hopefully some of those will look important to you, and we'll see you at those too. Rachel asks, so a project that doesn't have ongoing environmental mitigations has the federal nexus expiring after 3 years. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct. What we said was the environmental records need to be kept until the project is closed out, and we said that the project is closed out according to the definitions of what a project is closed out by the program area itself. Okay. And that really basically means that there's no federal interest in continuing on to monitor the project. There's no federal financial requirement or what have you. When all of those are done, okay, you still need to consider whether there are, and we're going to be talking decades when all that's done, but you still need to consider, even after that, that there might be ongoing mitigation measures that in effect have no terminus. That's what we were trying to say.
So in NSP, when there may be program income that gets generated for quite a while, that will certainly, your project isn't closed out until at least until all that is used up.
Well, I think a better example from NSP would be if you have a project that has an affordability period on it. You have met a national objective at the time that a family, an income-eligible family, occupies the property. But then, depending on how much of a subsidy they received, how large of an NSP investment was involved, that would determine the length of the affordability period. So let's, for example, say it was 15 years based on levels of subsidy. What Charlie's saying is, at that point is, I guess, the first opportunity when you can look at your environmental review obligations being met. But there are other factors that could be considered which may cause it to stretch beyond that 15 years.
If, in fact, the environmental review, when it was done, okay, or if, in fact, you become aware of conditions that really even you needed to revise the environmental review, but let's not even go into that. If, when the environmental review was done, you had said that this project needs to, as I said before, allow methane gas under certain pressures to be released below grade. Okay, maybe this has been built on a former garbage dump. Okay, fill the site, and as a result, there's some extra gas underground that needs to be relieved. Well, you need to make sure that as long as that condition exists, that there's some way of safely releasing that gas over time, even though the HUD project may be
completed.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to talk about, ongoing mitigation, even after the project is completed.
Right. So at a minimum, when the affordability period is up, your obligation is up, unless you are dealing with one of these circumstances.
Or to get to the absurd on it, if you were required to put up a certain dike or levee, when the HUD project was closed, you wouldn't tear down the dike or levee. You'd make sure that was continued to be maintained.
Hopefully that clears that up for you, Rachel. PD asks, if a grantee with a Tier 1 reviewed project with sites to be determined decided to purchase a site within 1,000 feet of a major highway before a noise assessment was performed, how would you recommend that PJ respond to this?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say, like, just because you do a Tier 1, a Tier 1 says we've looked. What's a Tier 1 and a Tier 2? A Tier 1 says we've taken a general view of this neighborhood and we've identified just like maybe 5 issues. Maybe there might be noise, there might be floodplains, there might be historic preservation. And that allows you to request the release of funds, publish your notices and request the release of funds, and not publish notices and request release funds for each individual site. But it still requires that you got to do this environmental review before you've completed the environmental review process. And as we've noted, you're not allowed to commit to a project until you've completed the environmental review process. So has there been a violation? There definitely has been. What do we do about it? That's a good question. I would consult with my field environmental officer. It's a serious thing. I would threaten to take away the funds. Maybe there's a way of resolving that, and that's the type of thing that field environmental officers want to know about.
Roque asks, on NSP properties that are resold to a qualifying buyer, does the responsible entity need to conduct a reevaluation of the environmental clearance to ensure that no environmental issues have changed?
The answer to that question really is yours, David, as to whether or not when it's resold, is it still a HUD project?
Well, it'll remain a HUD project as long as there's an affordability period. So you have 2 transactions. You have the first when the grantee acquires it and rehabs it. Obviously, at that point in time, you'll have to do an environmental review. And then you have the point in time when the grantee sells it to the income-eligible buyer. From that perspective, the environmental review was already conducted, but as we were saying in one of the previous questions, the fact that the project is not closed out, meaning that there's going to be an affordability period on it for some length of time, there will continue to be an environmental obligation.
The other thing is, at a minimum, you're required to, provide it is still the same project as was originally approved, at a minimum you're required to determine whether environmental conditions have changed, okay, or whether the project has changed.
Is there any time period?
No.
Where that?
No.
Okay.
No. But if environmental conditions have changed, you're required to do a new environmental assessment, or if the project itself has changed, you're required to do a new environmental assessment.
What Charlie's referring to is 24 CFR 5847. And what some grantees do is they just put one piece of paper in the file. They call it a 5847 binding, and they say, hey, it's the same project. We did the review. It's here, and we're not going to change anything. So there's a paper trail showing that you've done it, but don't worry about it.
And the conditions haven't changed, or your awareness of the conditions hasn't changed. So you have to really meet all three of those tests. Again, as Eugene has said many times, check with your field environmental officer if you have any questions. Any other questions that are up there?
I'm scanning for others. At the moment, I see none.
Let me go back and underscore the same thing that Eugene said early on and stressed early on, and that is this section of the regulations 5822. It is perhaps the most violated section of the regulations because it's the most misunderstood. And that is a fact that you cannot commit HUD or non-HUD funds to a project, to a HUD project, unless and until the environmental review process is completed. Okay. And we define HUD project as that this process starts once there's an application for HUD assistance. Now, that application for HUD assistance can be an application to a local government from a nonprofit. It can be an application for a private developer to a local government. Whenever there is, in effect, that kind of formal legal recognition that there's a HUD project in the wind, and that this project, then from that point on, you need to make sure there's no commitment of HUD nor non-HUD assistance to that project. And notice I'm not just talking about funding, I'm talking about assistance.
Let me take a moment while we see if there's any other questions that come in. These NSP Resource Exchange resources and all kinds of information in the resource library and FAQs and training materials and just a huge and ever-growing wealth of information. It's all very well organized. If you're probably familiar with this site already, but if you're not, I'd recommend spending some time browsing around there, seeing all the different resources that are available to you. And
add, if I may, Ken, to that point, we are in the process. Eugene mentioned one on tribal consultation and historic preservation, but we're in the process of producing and putting on a whole series of webinars which will be announced very soon on environment. And I anticipate by the end of September that each one of these environmental compliance areas, be it historic preservation or noise or what have you, that there will be a separate webinar up on the environmental website. So stay tuned to that HUD environmental website, and hopefully these programs, if you haven't been able to participate in them directly, you'll be able to pull them down. And I hopefully that's the intention, and anyway, they'll be of use to you.
Great. We look forward to those. Rachel is asking, I thought that this definition of project was not promulgated in the 2007 draft environmental regs, and that it didn't include applications yet. Can you clarify?
Project is defined as, it's a very, very, very broad definition of project. Project is defined as anything that's geographically or functionally related. Okay. And that means that acquisition and demolition and construction and rehab and infrastructure, site improvements, etc., are all the kind of activities that are interrelated to the project. So it isn't just a matter of HUD funding one thing, but you have to look at the entire functionally related sets of activities in the project. Similarly, project is defined as geographically, territorially, so that it's all of the activities and mini projects, if you will, that are integrally related because they're nearby one another. That's what project is related to. What I was relating to was when the starting date is, in terms of application, is when is the starting date that you have to be concerned about not committing HUD funds? Obviously, if you buy a property 10 years ago and you don't really know what you're going to be doing with it, but you own the property and then you decide, gee, I think this is where we're going to build some housing 10 years later because we've got this property, and I think we're going to go after some HUD NSP money to see if we can't get some federal funds to help us with part of the financing of this project. The purchase of that property 10 years earlier is not a violation of the concept that you can't commit HUD funds. You can't commit non-HUD funds to a project because it wasn't a HUD project earlier. It was just your purchase of some land for which you didn't really know what you were going to do with it. So we require clearly, one of the clear thresholds is that if anyone applies either to HUD or to a recipient for HUD assistance of any form, that clearly that is a statement of intent to use HUD funds and therefore is subject to that prohibition against not committing HUD or non-HUD assistance. I hope that clarifies the point.
Thank you. That makes sense. Hopefully that cleared that up for you, Rachel. And Kathleen says that a property is purchased with NSP funding and placed in a land bank. 2 years later, it's sold to be rehabbed and rented. Do Part 58 regulations extend to the new owner?
NSP covered, right? Even what comes out of the land bank?
No. Only from the perspective that it has to be disposed of for an eligible use.
Well, then that is a requirement, and therefore, as long as there's a program requirement attached to that action, and there is obviously in disposition, as you just said, then yes, you do have to do an environmental review on the disposition of that property.
And I'd like to also put it from the perspective of why wouldn't you want to do that? You're trying to serve your constituents, and, you know, wouldn't they want to know that this property has been cleared for its intended use, that there's not a floodplain problem, that there's not a noise problem, that there's not a site contamination problem? Look at it from another perspective. What if 2 years after you sold it, there are some problems, and the buyer goes back and says, hey, how did you sell this piece of property to me? Sure, mistakes happen, and maybe you can make an honest mistake, but that's a lot better than saying, oh, we never even looked at this. You know, we never even saw that it met minimum requirements. You know, that's one of the goals of the program, is to serve your clients and to make sure that the property is suitable for its intended use.
Yeah, to some extent, I think the analogy of treating a project in the broadest sense as kind of an assembly line, and the environmental review process, if you will, is the quality control process in that assembly line.
when we do end here, when you leave the webinar, you'll be automatically taken to a survey. We'd appreciate any comments and you taking a couple minutes to answer the survey. And your opinions and comments are important. Helps us see how this went and to plan for the future. So we'd appreciate your participation there. And I would like to, it looks like we've come to the end of the questions. I'd like to thank our panelists, Eugene Goldfarb, who was our main presenter, also Charles Bean and David Noguera, who provided their perspectives on the environmental review process from HUD. Thank you all for doing this, spending your valuable time today, and for all of you who attended. We appreciate you being here. We wouldn't be here doing this without you. So thanks for doing this, and we hope to see you soon at another NSP webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.